Okay. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I want to introduce you all today to Dr. Mark Denny, a biology professor at Stanford University. He is the pioneer of ecological mechanics, and I have invited him today to talk about his work and experience. How are you, Dr. Denny?
I'm doing fine. I hope you're doing well.
Yeah, I'm doing great. Could you please introduce yourself a little more and as well as your work in ecological mechanics?
Um, okay, I'm not sure where to start. So biomechanics is sort of the area that I started off in. Even back up farther from that. So physiology is the big study about how plants and animals work. And so usually physiology is thought of as the processes that allow you to function. So respiration, digestion, all of those sorts of things. But associated with those processes are structures. So you and I need the bones to keep our bodies going, muscles and things like that. A big part of physiology is the physics and engineering of how those processes work. That's biomechanics. Biomechanics got started back in the 30s with some people Sir James Gray in England and people like that, studying fish locomotion and animal flight and things like that. So for decades, the holy grail of biomechanics was how does an individual organism function? How does it operate in its environment? So when I came along and sort of joined the field in the 1970s, that's where we were. But since then, in the past 4 or 5 decades, we've learned enough about how individual plants and animals work that it occurred to me that it was worth putting that together with ecology to see how not only they work individually, but how they interact with each other and with the environment. So expanding out from the application of physics and engineering to individuals, applying all of that to the interaction among plants and animals is what we think of as the ecological mechanics side of things. So that's where I've been for the last few decades, since way before you were born. And we're making slow progress as to figure out how it all works.
Right. Would you say that biomechanics or even ecological mechanics is a niche field of science?
A rich field, is that what you asked?
A
Or
niche. So
a
it's
niche?
not a lot
Well,
of people study it.
a niche, no. Well, it is rich, and I think I think it's moved beyond. Well, it depends on your definition of niche. Obviously, it's a small field now, but I think it's quickly moving beyond that, driven by the severity of the problem we have with climate change. So understanding how plants and animals interact with the environment while the environment is changing, that understanding is necessary in order to be able to predict what's going to happen. The climate is obviously, as you well know, changing rapidly. Being able to predict all the complexities that are associated with that is going to involve the ecological mechanics side of things. And I think that yes, it's a niche field in that I don't know, for whatever reason, other than a few sort of small parts of biology, biologists in general don't like math and physics. I've never understood why. It's incredibly interesting to me. So that somebody who wants to get into this field has to have a little bit of a passion for, or at least a willingness to absorb some mathematics and some engineering and physics. And for whatever reason, a lot of biologists sort of hesitate at that. So we've drawn on a fairly small percentage of people in getting into the field.
Hmm. Interesting. And I must ask, what drew you to this field? I've done a lot of research on your work, but I don't think you've ever mentioned why you chose to, do research in biomechanics.
Well, it was one of those interesting. I've been incredibly lucky in my life and in my career. So when I was an undergraduate, I went to Duke University, and I started off thinking I was going to be a doctor. My dad was a doctor, and that seemed okay. Then I went to the Marine Station when I was a third year there, and I saw how much fun graduate students were having, and I'd already seen how sort of dismal it was spending your days in a hospital. So oh, this will be fun. And then I'd always put off taking physics until my senior year. So I took a physics class and just really enjoyed it. Unlike the math department, which the most dismal people taught calculus. I took calculus Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday mornings at 8 o'clock, if you can imagine, and just put me to sleep. But the physics department assigned their best teachers to teach introductory physics. I really enjoyed it. And then the second half of my final year, I took a class from Steve Wainwright and Steve Vogel, who are two of the leading lights in biomechanics. You may have run across them. So I took their class and got really interested in how spider webs work, and wrote a paper on sort of the mechanics of spider webs just because it was fun. At that point, I didn't know what I was going to do after I graduated. I had applied to go to the Peace Corps and been accepted, and they were going to send me to Nepal to teach people how to fish in Nepal, of all things. But then Steve Wainwright contacted me and heard about what I was planning, and in his quote, he was worried that I was going to drop out of science. So he hired me for a year on his own nickel to work on spider silk. So I had a year of fun doing that, and then sort of got passed in the pipeline for biomechanics. So it just sort of happened into it. If I'd known, I probably would have gone into engineering in college and wouldn't have known about biology. If I'd known about physics earlier, I would have done something different. But to have the two come together at the end of that 1 year, and then that opportunity to work for you're just doing what I wanted to do, sort of settled me on the field.
Wow, okay. Actually, that experiment really interested me. What exactly were you studying about spider webs?
Oh, I'm talking about the spider webs that you know, if you're walking down a forest path and you run face on into a spider web, the big orb webs. So they're made out of silk, which is a pure protein. And something like, I don't know, 20-30% of a spider's protein, all the protein they have in their body, they expend every day to spin that web. Now, obviously, the bigger web they can cast, I mean, bugs just fly into it. The bigger the area they can cover, the more flies they can catch, and the better off they are. For a given amount of silk you have in your body, you want to make those threads as thin as possible to get as much area as possible. So the threads are only a micron or two in diameter. But to catch a bug with threads that are that thin, the threads have to have a pretty amazing strength. So that was, you just forget how fast the fly flies and what its weight is. You know what its kinetic energy is. If that kinetic energy has to be absorbed by the web. You started working down the physics of that. And it's really clear that the material has to be pretty exceptional. So I spent a year measuring the mechanical properties of spider silk, and it's weight for weight, it's an order of magnitude stronger than steel. It's stronger than Kevlar that they make bulletproof vests out of. It's a really incredible material. That's what led me into it. I used to go over to the engineering department. They had a machine that would pull on things. It was usually pulling on big pieces of steel or copper or whatever. They had a little tiny force transducer to measure small forces. So I put a little piece of spider silk in there and pull on it. It was fine. But if you were just walking by, an engineer walking by, it was look like I was pulling on air because you couldn't see it. It's only a micron. Okay. So I had all these people sticking their head around the door, wondering what was going on with me pulling on little bits of air. But no, it was really this incredibly thin, incredibly strong material. So that's what got me into it.
Wow, okay. Sounds like a pretty good start to biomechanic research.
Oh,
I believe I also read about one of your researches done on water striders. Is that right? And I believe there's a term that came from that research called Denny's paradox.
yeah, well, this is a funny story too as well. Yes, so water striders are these little bugs that scoot around on slow-moving lakes and ponds and streams. You've seen them, okay. Normally you notice them because their 6 legs sit on the water and you get a little dimple. They're floating on the surface tension of the water. The way at least back then, the way they were thought to move is when they stroke their legs backwards, they create a bow wave in the water, and that's what they push against. So if you drive a boat through the water, you get a wave in front of it, and that gives resistance to the boat moving. Well, if you put your legs backwards, you create a wave, and that's what they were thought to move against. Well, waves like that they're like the little ripples you get on ponds. They're well, two kinds of waves on water. There are waves where the restoring force, you push the water up or push it down, it is gravity that pulls it back. So you have, those are gravitational waves. But there's also capillary waves where it's the capillarity of the water, the surface tension of the water that's the restoring force. So the waves that, for the small waves that water striders push against are these capillary waves. And there's an odd thing about the capillary waves is there's a minimum speed at which they can move. If you are a shorter wave or a longer wave, you travel faster than 23 centimeters a second, but 23 centimeters per second, they can't go any slower than that. Well, little tiny water striders, they can't move their legs fast enough to get up to 23 centimeters a second. So if they have to make waves to push against them and go anywhere, and these capillary waves that are doing it, how do the little ones walk around? And so that I proposed that or I just sort of mentioned that in one book. You know, I didn't call it a paradox. So it wasn't until some people back at Harvard and MIT figured out what was really going on, that they found it's not just the waves that do it. It's some movement in the water that does it. So they said that they had solved Denny's paradox. So it was only a paradox after it had been solved. So I'm incredibly honored to have a paradox named after me, but it wasn't there until somebody made it not a paradox. So it's a little bit paradoxical. Anyway, yeah, so that's the story behind the Denny's paradox.
Right, I love that story. I'm also curious, is there any topic that you're currently researching, and would it be possible for you to share it with us?
Well, a couple of things. One is I've lately gotten with a colleague up at Washington State, guy named Wes Dowd. I've gotten more into some straight-on physiology rather than biomechanics, dealing with these little tiny copepods that live in splash pools on the shore here. So we most of the shores in the world aren't sandy; they're rocky, and if you have waves up on these topographically complex shores, you'll get little pools that are way above the tide. And every once in a while, a wave will come along and splash up some seawater in there. So they're sort of ephemeral; they come and go, but they're a really nasty environment. So that the pools around here, they can get up to mid 40s Celsius during the day and then cool down at night. They have algae in them so that they are super saturated with oxygen during the day, and then everything sucks up the oxygen at night, so they go anoxic at night. pH changes, all sorts of things change in those pools. These little copepods are the only animals that live in there. So how do they do it? So we've been looking at some of the physiology about how they do that. So it turns out also as the pools dry out, the salinity goes up. I mean, the salt can't evaporate. As the water goes away, the salinity goes up. So the salinity goes from basically fresh water up to, just salt. So through a bunch of experiments, what we found was that as the salinity goes up, the thermal tolerance of those little copepods goes up as well. As you would expect, on hot days, more water is going to evaporate. So there's this correlation between salinity and temperature. Well, it turns out that the way these animals cope with high salinity, most invertebrates are isosmotic. So they make their body the same osmotic pressure as the water around them. The way these copepods do that is by pumping an amino acid proline into their cells. So as the salt content goes up, they up the content of proline, just as a way of coping with the salinity. It turns out that proline is also a thermal protectant. It keeps proteins from denaturing at high temperatures. So they have this automatic connection between, if the salinity goes up, they cope with that, but that also increases their thermal tolerance. So they're pre-adapted to these high temperatures. So the thought was that if there are more things out there that do have those sorts of connections, two stressors, high salinity, high temperature, actually make you stronger than either one of those stressors alone. So if that's a more general sort of process where multiple stressors, instead of making things worse, make things better, that's something we need to take into account as the climate changes. So with climate change, there's going to be a whole bunch of different kinds of stresses, but they may interact to actually help plants and animals rather than making it worse. So that's what we've been up to lately.
Okay. And that reminds me, I believe I listened to your podcast 2 years ago with Big Biology.
Mhm.
And I believe you're also talking about marine animals in that podcast. And you were saying rising temperatures have actually sometimes don't have a direct effect on marine invertebrates, right? But I'm just curious, in general, in what ways can these extreme climate changes affect the environment or affect organisms?
Well, it depends on what you mean by extreme.
I guess any kind of climate change. I mean, everything we're going through these days, rising temperatures, um, higher sea levels
Yeah, well, I mean, in general, it's going to make things worse. Okay. I
in
mean,
general.
because things are happening so fast. Extremes, at least one way to think about extremes are the things that happen rarely and they're really unusual. Okay. And
Mhm.
so if you have if extremes are rare enough, then plants and animals, organisms don't have any way of other than the sort of thing I was just talking about, have any way of anticipating that and coping with that. If they happen often enough, then they aren't really extreme in a statistical sense, but they're sort of normal life, and things can evolution can cope with that. So that evolution, I mean, it doesn't optimize things. It just copes with what it's got and makes things a little bit better. So if you have an extreme things that wax things down, you might have selected for organisms that could survive that. But if that survival includes some cost to it, then evolution will gradually bring you back to something that's less costly and therefore less capable of coping with extremes. So if the extremes happen sort of intermittently, but rarely, evolution can't really take care of it. If they happen often enough, then you can just sort of ramp up. So one of the things that statisticians and ecological mechanics are looking at is how you do what you think of as what is extreme, how those are going to change with the climate, how often they're going to change, and what that effect of that is going to be on the capability of organisms to resist it. So it's a complicated subject involving meteorologists, ecological mechanics, physiologists, population biologists. It all gets tied together, hopefully, with the ability to predict some of this stuff. And prediction is power. So maybe we can
Mhm.
do something about it.
Right. And actually, my follow-up question to that was about evolution. I was wondering how ecological mechanics ties in with evolution. Do you have any examples to how it may, I don't know, maybe promote evolution, or even evolution can be a way of fixing these changes?
Yeah, we again, Westad and I working together quite number of years ago now, had an example of this with limpets. So these are the little cone-shaped shells that you get on the shore, and one of the limpets here, Ladia gigantea, one of my favorite organisms. Um, it's territorial. So out on the rock, I mean, some of these things are the size of my hand, a big one, and most of them are smaller than that. But they'll crawl around to bulldoze anything out of an area on the rock, maintain an open area on the rock. And this one particular seaweed grows near Hildenbrandia, sort of a crusty thing. It's what they eat. But because they're territorial, it means that when times get tough, they aren't going to run away. They just sit there and take it, particularly with high temperatures. So they just hunker down on their home scar and take the high temperatures. Um, well, what we found is that if you go out and measure their thermal tolerance, it's whatever it is, and if you measure the temperature that we have a mechanical or anyway a statistical model of what their temperature ought to be based on what the environment is. So we can estimate through some interesting statistics what maximum temperature they should see in every year. And it turns out that their thermal tolerance is about 7 degrees above the temperature they would expect to see in a normal year. Now,
Mhm.
how do you evolve? And there's presumably some cost to having that high thermal tolerance. How do you evolve that high thermal tolerance to something you've never seen? Where does evolution know the choice? Well, it turns out that again we have a model which can relate all the different aspects of the environment, wind speed, how hot the sun is, what the air temperature is, what the water temperature is, all those sorts of things, to what the body temperature of a limpet ought to be. And every once in a while, if you run the model or go out and look, every once in a while, you'll hit a low tide, a really low tide, when there aren't any ways to splash water up and cool them. The air temperature is high. It's a clear day, so there's a lot of sun, no wind, and all those things will come together just by coincidence to give you a really high temperature. Well, the model says that those ought to happen only every 10, 12, 15 years, which is more than the life of any individual limpet. But if you have these extreme events every once in a while, you'll kill everybody but the ones who just by, I mean, evolution goes by you just rearrange genes and you have a variety of things of genotypes there, and you select the ones that are most viable. Well, every 25 years or so, one of these heat waves will come along and select the limpets that are the most thermally tolerant. And if you run the model, it says after a while, you sort of level out at a phenotype, a genotype that is about 7 degrees above what the environment is. So yes, evolution plays into this, but it plays in not by slowly creeping up on what is adapted, but by these jumps with these extremes that are governing what's going on. So there's a big question in ecology: is it the slow every year sort of climate that the things are responding to, or is it the extremes that are governing what's going on? And the obvious answer is it's both. But at least in some cases, like the limpets, it looks like these rare, chancy, extreme temperatures are what's governing the evolution. So here's a case where we have a physics model that relates the environment to what the body temperature is, and then body temperature is physiology, do they survive or not? So we're tying physics to physiology to predict evolution.
Right, okay. I actually want to have a follow-up question to one thing you talked about. You said that it took 25 years for, the environment to have these heat waves, and there was a jump in evolution between. So how do researchers research that? I mean, do they continue the experiment for more than 25 years? It sounds like a difficult process.
It is, and this is where this has so much fun. There's something called the statistics of extremes. Okay.
Okay.
So have you had a statistics course of any sort?
No, unfortunately.
Okay. Well, most of the statistics is you've heard of a bell-shaped curve, a normal curve. Okay.
Yes.
So that says you've got a certain average, a certain mean, and then there's some distribution around that mean. And most of the statistics deals with how far the mean, how far away from that mean you are in terms of what's going on. But then there's and you can predict from, I mean, there's theory that says, okay, here's what the shape of this normal curve ought to be mathematically. But then there's also a set of statistics called the statistics of extremes. It's very descriptive, which deals with not where things are around the center of that distribution, but what happens way out in the tails, way out in the extremes. And it turns out that you can predict based on a few observations how extreme something ought to be. It's really strange. It's a way of extrapolating from the data you have, but it actually works. So if you have for our case, we had 10 years worth of environmental data, real empirical data, that we could predict what the body temperature of a limpet would be. Well, we could take each one of those, the different things, wind speed, water temperature, whatever, in there, and sort of reshuffle those as if the environmental dice had rolled differently, and calculate what would happen to the body temperature. And you can run that. We can do it for a year, which means just let the computer run. You can do it for 1,000 years, okay, and see on average how often you would get one of these extreme events. They don't occur every 25 years. The average is 25 years or something like that. Some are quite close, some are far away. Something called a Poisson distribution. But statistics will allow you to predict from a few measurements what should happen at the extremes. So the best example, what actually got me into this, was an engineer dropped by my office and we started chatting about it. He says, do you know about airplane engines? And I said, well, okay, they make the airplane go. And he said, well, yeah, what you want is, an airplane engine nowadays has this big fan in the front that forces air in, and the air goes out fast the other end. As they're flying through the air, there's a lot of turbulence on that fan, and every once in a while, it'll just happen to be such that the engine will flame out, which isn't a good thing. And you want to be able to predict that. For an engine on an airplane, that's rated in the number of flameouts you get per 100 hours of flying time, and you want that number to be small. Well, the way they actually test that, you aren't going to fly a prototype engine for thousands and thousands of hours to measure that. So the way they measure that is they put the engine in an apparatus, and for 10 minutes, measure what the turbulence like is on the front of that. And from that, they extrapolate out to how many times it would flame out in 100 flying hours. And it turns out that when they've done that, it actually works. So taking a small amount of data, intense data, you can predict how often these extremes are going to be, as long as you're dealing with physical processes that obey physics. Okay. I think there's the application of that in climate change is going to be really interesting. We're getting enough data, short-term data, to be able to predict statistically how bad it could be long term without ever having to wait around for the long term.
Wow,
Kind
that's
of
an
cool.
interesting statistical application on ecology and biology.
Oh,
And just a question to tie in everything together. You talk a lot about, trying to combat climate change by looking at these data that you collect through ecology and studying animals, but it is quite an interdisciplinary, research, isn't it? How do you
oh,
usually approach these research questions or studies? Because there's so many components you can study.
well, it's that interdisciplinarity that's always just fascinated me. Um, so I just try to absorb as much information as I can and put it together. Um, my students over the years have either come from biology and need to learn the engineering and the math, or they come from engineering and math and need to learn the biology. You want to guess which set of students has had a harder time getting into the field? Is it the engineers or is it the biologists?
Um, I feel like it's the engineers because biology isn't that easy to learn, at least for me.
Um, well, it is. It's the engineers, but not for that reason. Engineering is, it's math, it's physics, it's fairly easy to learn. The real hitch has been that for engineers, they're really used to having there is an answer to this problem. All the problem sets they go through, it's math to come up with the answer. Okay. And in biology, there seldom is the answer. It's a fuzzy sort of thing. So the biologists find it fairly easy to, or at least straightforward, to absorb the math and the engineering, the physics. The engineers have a heck of a time coming up with asking a question that is interesting and big, where they realize that they aren't going to get an exact answer, and realizing that okay, a good enough answer is good enough. That's progress. It's been an interesting match there. Um, I started off in biology and had picked up the engineering and the math on the side. I've enjoyed the process, and I hope some of my students have enjoyed it as well. I think it's working at the interface between fields, either 2 fields or 3 fields or however many. That's where the progress is going to be, and at least in my mind, that's where the fun is.
Right. Well, I've certainly enjoyed this interview, and this actually leads me to my last question. Uh, I'm just wondering if you have any advice, if you have one advice you could give to students, what would it be?
Um, learn as much math as you can. I think 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 broadly, think interdisciplinarily. Think about big questions, but then just absorb as much as you can, as many different fields. If you're a biologist, take physics and enjoy it. If you're a biologist, by all means, take statistics and learn as much math as you can. Those are not so much the skills there, but it's the perspective. It's a different way of thinking about things. Biologists think about things in one way, physicists think about it in another way. Putting that together would be my best advice. Just be broad.
Right. And that is the end of the interview. Thank you so much, Dr. Denny, for participating in this interview with me. And obviously, thank you to everyone who watches this video. And I'll see you guys next time.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. I appreciate it.